Awesome. So we are been so grateful that everyone's been able to join us. I've been learning a ton. Look forward to every single talk that we've had this week, or this semester. At the next one, we have 3 officers from the North Carolina police force that will be talking about, our state troopers will be talking about how does you integrate police data into enforcement and how you can maybe promote safe systems that way. And then after that, we have several interesting talks from Shaquila Smith of the CDC, and I know Kristen Hospital-Lake from Public Health will be here. So staying involved. We have a great lineup to close out the semester. Make sure that you sign in and grab a reflection sheet. If you have any thoughts on our discussion this morning, fill that out. Looks like we're going to have something interactive. And as always, thank you again. This is once again done by the CSCRS. We're going to be talking about this Coffee and Conversation meeting and all the things we're learning about it this week, as some of the associate directors of the CSCRS are actually coming to Chapel Hill later this week. And so everything that I've been learning, which is a lot, we're probably going to be sharing. So this will be informing later work. So all the feedback that y'all give us, especially the students, really helps us make this better. So with that, Seth, if you would, introduce our speaker today. Any questions?
Good morning, everybody. Spring has finally arrived. Doesn't it feel nice?
No,
What's that?
it's snow on Sunday.
Oh,
Wait. I saw rain on my phone. That's a snowflake.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. What is that called? Confirmation bias? Anyway. Very pleased to welcome Dr. Noreen McDonald. Who here doesn't know Noreen? Okay, everyone knows Noreen. I got introduced to Noreen, ever since I started at HSRC, working in Safe Process School, actually. And Noreen was looking at sort of the trends along with school children, how they get to and from school, the kind of social dynamics, family dynamics related to that. And then it's really branched out to look at many other things. One of the things I think is most fascinating, one of the recent work we've done is on time use, millennials. And everyone's kind of familiar, right, with the driver's licensing sort of declining over time. That's been happening actually quite a while, like 30, 40 years now, ever so steadily. But Noreen was looking at the substitution effects of that, which is fascinating. So students and millennials aren't driving as much, so are they active more? And the answer is, doesn't seem like it, right? So you start wondering, what are they doing exactly? Probably a little more sedentary. Noreen takes this sort of global look at trends and is very interested in, I think, in a critical kind of topic today on shared mobility and the impact that technology and sort of changes to the urban form are going to have on different road users. So we're very pleased to be working with Noreen as an associate director of the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety to start looking at these things. What's going to happen with autonomous vehicles and people outside of those vehicles? Things of that nature. So we're very pleased to be working with Noreen. Your work speaks for itself, and please join me in welcoming you to the station.
A lovely introduction, like that really happens in the world. So that was so nice. Thank you. So thanks to everybody for coming today. We've had talks on a really wide-ranging subject matter from Alan De La Pena, the Injury Prevention Branch, folks talking about moral philosophy and how it fits into thinking about safety. So I'm today hoping to bring it back to thinking particularly about city planning, but really in some ways classic land use planning, like the things that you and the tools that you think of as planners sitting in city planning departments. The question I want us to engage with for the entire time today is there a connection between those people sitting in city planning departments and approving subdivisions and doing long-range planning and road safety? And I'll argue that there is. But mostly I'm gonna ask you that question, and then I'd like us to think through what are those connections, what are some of those goals, how does that play out? So the format may be a little bit more different than some of the other talks that I've attended, where I'm gonna have a significant amount of group work. So don't worry, we'll get to that, we'll mix you up, I know. I'm like 8:30, you're like, really? No, I was not planning on that. I got here, is that not enough? But anyway, so, and please just interrupt me as we're going. So this basically, as I said, I'll talk very briefly at the beginning, actually using a lot of the work of another planning professor that's also an associate director from CSCRS. Next time around, come up with an easier to pronounce acronym. Who's at Florida Atlantic, and then we'll work in small groups and then come back together. All right, so thinking about the connections between planning and not so much, transportation planning, as I was saying, sort of classic land use planning and road safety. What are those connections? So I'm sure you've all seen this number by now. This is a NHTSA report looking at a set of crash investigations and trying to look at what was sort of the primary reason for the crash, and so this 94% number gets thrown out a lot in many different contexts. It's us, right? We have seen the problem and it is I. And what I want us really to think about today is, we're talking about the environment here being listed as like 2%. That's pretty small. That would suggest why talk to planners, right? Because it's not a really significant part. So if you think this 94% number is what it's all about, and this is, how do we think about reducing that? And so this is what I was saying, this is some work that Eric Dumbaugh has presented and was kind enough to let me borrow here. But if it's all about us, right, making mistakes, then, you can improve our training. You can put in a bunch of, you make the vehicle smarter, more resistant to us being dumb, various things like that. And that's a lot of what we do, right? That's a lot of what the road safety field is about. And it doesn't really take into account some of these environmental things. But obviously there's other perspectives on this. This is from the Australian Safe Systems Principles, which you've, I'm sure, already seen. The first one is people make mistakes, right? And so rather than thinking of human error as something we can solve, maybe there's ways to mitigate it, but recognizing it's actually an intrinsic part of the system, and you have to design a system that's perhaps resilient to many of those errors. And this last statement there, the transport system should not result in the death or serious injury. Because on some level, the perspective, right, it becomes very, as you're thinking about it, if it's human error and people are at fault, well, consequence of individual actions. I mean, that's very much how we think in this country, right? And so they talk in terms of a forgiving road system. So these are some of those basic principles that are kind of challenging that idea that it's simply on the driver. And so you've seen throughout this talk series the term shared responsibility, right, between the system designers and the users. And so Eric expanded his model to include what he put here as an environmental box, right? So if the system designers now are really part of this equation, then if we think carefully about the geometric design, like, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't design roads for 65 and sign them 35 because, maybe people are really going to drive 65 on them. So thinking critically about the design fees. Or maybe we shouldn't create conditions where there's lots of, cuts in the driveway. You see the driveway policies listed here, right? So instead, thinking about how the users are going to act and sort of formally accepting that the designer needs to think very critically about that. So that's a real, you start to see the role, certainly, of the North Carolina Department of Transportation, right? And many of their approval processes in there, what their standard design is, right? Maybe there's a problem with this 2 lanes in each direction, turn lane in the middle, design speed of 55 design. But we're still not really thinking that much about land use planning, certainly. And Eric presented what I thought was a kind of a compelling example. It's, it's almost sort of bordering perhaps on melodramatic, but I think it brings home some of the connections in an anecdotal but powerful way about how planning does start to play in, and how we can maybe think about this environmental box a little bit more broadly. So he shared this story, which was of a mother being sentenced because her child, who's shown there, was hit. And what happened was they got off a bus, and I'll show, so here's an image of where they were, and you can see the bus stop there, right, the little blue. They got off the bus, and they were living in the apartments across the street, and they crossed the most direct way that one would cross, which was not a crosswalk, right? And in fact, on many high-volume arterials, you literally can't cross the street if you try to use the arterials. You're almost, in some cases, sort of forced to jaywalk just because of the platooning of the cars. But they did that. They were hit, and the child was hit. And the mother was convicted of manslaughter and responsibility in that. Clearly it turned out to be not a great decision. There was a crosswalk, I think a few, within a little ways back up. But if we think about it maybe a little bit more critically, somebody designed this, right? So somebody designed this roadway. Somebody designed an apartment complex, which maybe had a lot of people that used transit in it. I don't know what kind of housing it was. But certainly we know that probably rates of transit use are a little bit higher in multifamily. And they made the bus stop pretty inaccessible, right? All of us here have either, many of you may live on around 54, certainly most of us have driven on 54. Like, we designed our own situation that way, right? Great bus system, bus service, and people have to run across 54 in order to access many of those buses, right? So they're creating very unsafe conditions. So is that like the user's fault? Like, you shouldn't cross there, right? You knew it wasn't a marked crosswalk, but the system is essentially set up to force that decision onto people, right? And so that is, I think, what's, sort of as terrible as this example is, it starts us thinking much more upstream from the individual level decision to thinking about, well, who permitted the housing development? What conditions were put on that, or how did they work with the transit system about where the bus stops would be placed? And there could have been a median cut there, right? It's not impossible. You could have designed it to facilitate connection. Why wasn't that done, right? And so Eric from that put in this last box, which he called organizational. I'm thinking of, in this context today, as much more about really physical planning, land use planning. So thinking about things like the development approval process, the zoning ordinances that we have. Where can we put multifamily housing? What type of road access is required? What type of transit access? Even sort of longer range visioning documents which think about how the community will develop long term. Okay, so what I want us to do today is, since many of you, not everybody here is connected to planning, but many of you are, and so what I want to do is challenge us to really think about 4 specific land use planning tools and techniques. How do they connect to road safety? Right, so we're going to break up into groups of 3 and 4, and so many of you tend to sit with people you already know, so you're not allowed to work with people you already know. You should certainly have at least one student, planning student in your group. And I have a list of potential planning processes. You're not restricted to this. If there's something that your group wants to discuss that's not on there, but that's the ones that I'm suggesting you start with. And so what you probably want to do is start first by making sure you're all on the same page about what that planning process, tool, technique actually is. And so make sure you're on the same page about that. And then think about how that connects to road safety, right? In a theoretical sense, I don't mean that it currently does, but how does it actually impact the safety of our communities? And then go to the next step of, is there a way to make road safety more explicit in that process, right? So right now, I think the argument I would make is that there are road safety impacts of all these decisions, but they're largely unaccounted for, or certainly not really thought about. So go through, think about what they are, and then think about, are there any creative ways to bring road safety into that conversation? So come up with the answers to both those questions, and then we'll come back and discuss it as a group. And there may be some, particularly in this question of how could you bring road safety into the process, if there's common themes across some of the different types of processes, from development approval to long-range comprehensive planning. Okay? All right. So your first job is you got to move, because you're sitting near people you already know. So make sure you have at least one planning student, and try not to have 2 people from the same organization. I guess unless you're a student. Okay, you can sort of stay where you are in your groups, but just maybe turn so we're all kind of in the same direction. All right, so what I'm going to ask each group to do is just tell us sort of what process they chose, and then your thoughts on the answers to these 2 questions, and particularly if you had any specific thoughts about how road safety could be incorporated, let's make sure we capture that. Okay, so we'll go around, capture it from each group, and then have a discussion that focuses on all the ideas that came out about operationalize on it. Okay? Who would like to go first? Colin. All right, I'm calling you guys. Oh, and say your name if you could.
Okay. Eric Rogman at Highway Safety. We chatted a bit about all those different options, and we chose the development approval process. We thought that sort of combined the best of some of the others, because I was sort of thinking it might be a synthesis of a couple of those in order to be sure you're meeting all the necessary regulations and approvals. That way there will be more input. So if there's all of an approval process involving the community, and perhaps even the city, depending on the size of the city. That would get enough people involved in it that perhaps you get lots of perspective.
So you mean actually, instead of having, like normally right now, site review involves like planners, and then here NCDOT has to sign off on some of the plan. So sort of increasing the number of departments that gets shuffled to,
yes.
like maybe,
Well,
most towns don't have public health, but in some way like
get more involved. In terms of the traffic, the road safeties, we sort of just talked about, depending on what it is being approved. I mean, if you're talking about, hey, putting in a small shopping center, an apartment complex, a new residential area, obviously it's going to affect a lot of the local traffic volumes. different kinds of things. When you add that, that's going to affect all the community or the residential areas and the local parts that are connected to it, and have to be accounted for in terms of taking a look at whether now stop signs should be put in, a possible roundabout. There are different ways to help keep the traffic moving. A single left turn lane into an apartment, into a residential area, or into a shopping area. That sort of thing.
right
Take a look at all those to try to make sure you don't slow the traffic down, and hopefully make it as safe as possible for people to continue to be able to use that area.
So right now, the development approval process is largely focused on maintaining vehicle throughput, or at least checking that vehicle throughput isn't adversely affected. So doing that, but maybe with more of an eye to see.
Yeah, and also look at potentially, if you're talking about, like, say, a residential area or perhaps a set of apartments or something, you may end up bringing more children and younger people into it, and you may want to also change the speed limit.
We also talked about the possibility of adding some sort of health impact assessment into the development approval process, making sure it captures injuries.
Okay. Another group, there were a few groups, I think development approval was actually the most popular one. So another group that did development approval, why don't we go to them? Will, do you want to tell us what your group is?
I'm Will, I'm a first year student here at planning. And one of the things we talked about within development approval processes was transportation impacts and how they could be tweaked to talk about safety as well. As traffic flow, which is what they tend to focus on. And one idea that we had that we thought was somewhat creative was trying to incentivize developers to invest in things that will improve safety by saying if they're building on a corridor like Highway 54 or 15501, then if they pay for extra crosswalks or other safety things, they can have their approval processes expedited. That sort of thing. And then we tried to touch on comprehensive planning as well and suggested including Vision Zero principles in a comprehensive plan.
There could be approval timeline. Another group that did development approval.
For how the process is connected to road safety, the way, talk a little bit about the way developments are even cited on their parcels, so things like landscaping around driveways or setbacks could impact road safety, as well as connectivity between that development and other developments. Are you increasing the number of pedestrian and bicycle vehicle interactions, or are you keeping those appropriately separated as needed? And then we also talked about how, similar to the other groups, how the traffic and transportation impact assessments don't take into account or don't trigger any thresholds for development reviews. So things like what you're saying, if you exceed a certain traffic volume and you have a certain density, or a certain number of people are moving into that area because of that development, are you then triggering something like what would you call it? A speed limit review or a road safety audit, so that the town can go out or the DOT can go out and look at safety impacts. So that's not even a part of traffic impact assessment right now.
So actually, you're talking about sort of incorporating something specifically either in the guidelines or the ordinance, so that it's not perhaps as ad hoc as it is right now. So now if you get somebody who is engaged on these issues, they can be looking for it. Okay, any other groups that did development approval process? Okay, so do you guys want to go?
Yeah, we did comprehensive plans, and we talked a lot about how it's related to road safety because of how your plans for your community are for the future really influence your mode of choice and how people are going to travel in the future. For accounting for road safety, I think we talked quite a bit about changing things in the city ordinance so that you could mandate that different things are done. So we talked about how you would define road safety and like, so maybe if you have like a residential zone or something, you could say, well, we want the streets in the single family residential zone to be this width, and curb cuts are only a certain number of feet apart. Exactly. What is it about?
So perhaps like in a comprehensive plan, you have a transportation chapter, right, would normally be where it was. And if in the visioning process or in other processes, road safety came up as an issue for the community, it could be incorporated as a goal to improve in that chapter. But the sort of implementation part would be through the zoning ordinances and the street plan.
Yeah, so we touched on street standards and talked a little bit about how it tied in with subdivision regulations as well. So the link to safety seems pretty clear with street design, looking at the roadway design speed and how that affects how fast traffic goes, with crosswalk placement and pedestrian facilities, and whether those are actually meeting the needs of the community that is traveling through that area, and block length considerations as well. Having those tied into street design standards was part of our conversation. And in terms of how road safety could be better accounted for, we talked a little bit about just trying to take into account transit stop placement, transit use, kind of the broader context of land use in the street standard setting or decision process. And then we also talked a lot about how when we're determining the street standards or looking at those and applying them to local settings, how we might have more meaningful community engagement and also kind of integrate consideration of disparities and the needs of underserved communities. One of the challenges we talked about is how the street standards are set by DOTs and sort of imposed on local communities in conditions that may not be appropriate. We talked a lot more about the challenges than the solutions.
And North Carolina is sort of different, right, than most places, because NCDOT has a large influence on what in most places would be local roads. Okay, then I think you guys know that.
Well, I'd give an example that I mentioned to the group, because so about 7 years ago, a community in North Raleigh, because after you build it, you've got to live with it and all that, found an unsafe stretch of road in their community and couldn't get DOT to pay attention to it or do it. So they got together and they did what I've done in public health, an assessment of the road conditions and brought it to DOT. And the reaction from DOT is to sue the community group for practicing engineering without a license. And that was a big national story and all that. So, that was sort of my value system thing, because all these systems are in silos. If you watch in the news, there's another house in Raleigh that had a car crash into it 6 times over like a 2-year period of time, because the community grew and they need to change, and the engineering standards, the values weren't to have highway safety more important than traffic flow. So it's that's my way of looking at it, is to get a safety value into a system that's more designed for traffic flow and economic and commerce development. And she had a really good example of Carrie building into their values of having greenways into. And so the values are there, they can get incorporated.
So these questions of engagement, but really both bi-directional, right? Does the institution actually want to engage with the community and how receptive they are to it, and then from the community upwards as well?
I kind of see a common theme that everybody touched on is sort of shifting the conversation of what traffic standards, what street standards, are in general right now, or for a long time. I think we're starting to see this shift. The focus always seems to be on moving as many vehicles as you possibly can, and it seems like everybody here would like to maybe incorporate, how fast or easily pedestrians or other modes could move through, and having safety built into the process instead of just saying, vehicle level service. Are we slowing down cars? Are we moving fewer cars through? Like maybe making that a subordinate goal to some of these other safety.
And now we do have, there we go, more up here. We have the multimodal level of service. So you can look at pedestrian and bicycle level of service to look at the trade-offs between them, which is still not, it's not incredibly safety focused per se, but this is an interesting area where the question of what we have tools to measure, right? We have a very strong analytic framework for measuring capacity and volumes. It's wrong, but everybody kind of agrees on how to do it, right? And it's written into guidelines. Whereas on the safety side, there's
Can I add one more?
Yeah.
I guess it's important to keep the political realities in perspective. If you look at who donates to campaigns, if you're on the State Transportation Committee, always your top donor is a concrete or paving company, followed by a developer. So, public voice is kind of hard when big economic forces are in play to keep the pavement rolling.
Mm-hmm. Although, there is an interesting question about whether they have to be antithetical, right? Because on some level, this doesn't really get at the highway questions, right? There's a lot of pavement you could pour, and we're talking about arterials and local streets.
I'm curious about, you touched on the measurement, what do we measure, and what are we able to measure, and that's, I'm working with our more progressive western cities, and they're working to develop bicycles, they performance functions, and then they see that as a tool that they can potentially use to predict what will happen if this new development comes online, for qualities, thousands of cars on the streets of the neighborhoods, so they can push back, so they can have some leverage. But on the other hand, I'm not sure which is the better approach. Can we incorporate more values-based planning and balance that comes from people? How much can we measure? And people aren't even willing to measure the speed of traffic. They don't want to know. They measure mobility for cars, but they don't really measure speed in terms of and its effect on safety performance. And it's can be difficult to do, but that's a big question. Help us figure this out.
Right, I think that's a really good point. Like, we tend to think about, if we're going to bring road safety in, we need to kind of replicate this analytic and regulatory framework that we've developed, so that now there's tools and techniques that are focused on bicycle and pedestrian, or maybe road safety explicitly. But we have an entire literature talking about all the stuff that's wrong with the current tools and techniques, how all the forecasts are inaccurate, how they have all these adverse outcomes, and I can't imagine we do any better at these ones that are much more uncertain, right? We have a ton of data to look at for volumes and capacity. For roadway fatalities, like, that's a much harder game. So I think Libby's point about how values come into it and whether creating sort of turning the crank and having more impact statements, is that really the answer? I think what I found really creative was people got very quickly into thinking about how it could be written into ordinances or guidelines. So thinking about, I think particularly people that were in the development impact course, were thinking about thresholds, like where could road safety audits come in, sort of trying to balance some of those transaction costs, right? Of you're doing something like this means you now have to pay a consulting firm to do this, right? Like this is money, like, and so when is that appropriate? When isn't it appropriate, and how might you do it? I think some of the other things we've seen that are interesting, which are maybe not quite as fully on here, is some cities are experimenting by taking away regs. You know, saying, you know what, in the downtown area, maybe you don't need to do that parking study. Maybe you don't need to do that traffic impact analysis downtown. Like, and then that actually reduces costs. It doesn't give them as much leverage in their negotiations with the developer, but it takes away some of these adverse outcomes of planning for a ton of parking and increasing the road capacity so that nobody actually wants to walk there. So thinking about ways we can strip off regulations to maybe give flexibility back to the system is, I think, also important as well. I can barely see the time, but I think we need to wrap up now because most of you have a class to get to. But thank you very much. I think this was helpful for me to see all the different areas where people came up with ideas, and I hope for you it was also useful to engage in thinking more deeply about how planning connects to road safety.
Noreen, make sure you fill out your reflection sheets if you haven't picked one up yet. We'll be collecting those, and make sure you come in 2 weeks. It's going to be a great session. So thank you so much for being here, for your continued support, and have a great day.